at any site from different angles and kind of see under otherwise obstructed things that you might not get in a normal satellite image. So I'm going to zoom in on the address I punched in and click here on view and reset. I'll tilt and compass, make sure that I'm facing north and I'm looking straight down on it. And I'm going to move my zoom taskbar out of the way, sorry. All you need to do from this point is find save photo up on the toolbar here. And it's kind of lagging for me. Uh-oh, not responding. There we go. You have options to put in a title, you can write a legend, things like that. I'm not too concerned with that here. The one thing I will change is my resolution. So what's really useful about Google Earth is it provides a scale down at the bottom right-hand corner. And if you go up in resolution to about 1080, it's going to get us to a more useful scale, like 30, for example. I want to make sure I'm going to tilt and compass. You can play around with it to get it exactly as you want. For example's sake, I'm just going to call it there. Save it. And at this point, you could print this out and use tracing paper and trace over all your lines if you want. For example's sake, I'm instead going to use a program called Sketchup. This is something you can use for architectural purposes, but it's also great for landscape design if you really want to get into the weeds of detail. So I'm just going to import my picture. If you are interested in SketchUp, this is something you can get a 30-day free trial to play around with. It has many uses. So I'll drop my base map in. What I will typically do here is, see, my scale is 40 feet. I want to truth out the size, just like we did in our tape measure and graph method. So I'll draw a line that's 40 feet. You can see that it is quite a lot bigger than my image is right now. And I would want to resize it, be matching up the scale with my line. I'm not going to bother with that right now, just for time's sake. And so just to give you the very basic outline of what we're doing here, we're going to outline the house. And again, I'm not being very careful because just going for the basic concept here. I'm going to outline my hardscapes. So I know where my sidewalks are, paths, things like that. I might say, I want to note that I've got trees here. Again, please see how rough we're going here. Then you can delete the image. At its simplest, this is sloppy, but this could be how you create your base map. Just a quick way to get yourself started. So here, oh, I went to the beginning. Sorry about that. Okay. And it looks like it's switched to me. Sorry, Nick, can you tell me if we're seeing my presenter mode, if you're seeing the full screen?
We're seeing the next slide as well, not the full screen.
That should do it then. We good now?
We are good.
All right, I'm not used to the dual monitor. Great tool, but anyway, moving on. So once you've got your base map, it's basically the best tool in your notebook for making thoughtful observations. So thoughtful observation is the cornerstone of good design. At DailyX, we use a design framework called Permaculture Design that some of you may be familiar with. Permaculture is like a portmanteau or a combination of the words permanent and agriculture. It's about planet care, plant care, people care, and fair share. So at its simplest, it's just a design framework that's modeled on careful observation of natural systems. So you want to be spending a good amount of time in your landscape, just paying attention to what's going on. You want to start with big and move to small. So you look at these patterns, like how does the landscape naturally want to grow? How did the land look before your neighborhood or town or city was developed? For those of us in the Bay Area, maybe it was oak savanna, maybe it was redwood forest, tule wetland, and so on. With that in mind, you might think, what kind of plant, grow in that ecosystem, and then what specific plants grow in that ecosystem that will be really useful to you as you're making your own plant selections and placements. So this quote on screen here is from Toby Hemingway, who wrote the book Gaia's Garden, A Guide to Home-Scale Permaculture. So for anyone who gets inspired by this presentation and wants to really dig into this like permaculture, thoughtful observation, design framework, it's an invaluable book. I couldn't recommend it highly enough. So speaking of patterns, talk about what we call sectors. Sector is just a pattern that exists beyond your landscape. It starts outside your landscape, it moves through it. So we're talking about big scale macro stuff, like the sun direction and exposure at different times of year. Where does the sun set compared to your landscape in winter versus spring equinox or the summer solstice and so on? This will be really useful as you're deciding where to place plants that have different sun. Similarly, you want to know things like how water moves through your landscape and how humans move through your landscape, where you might be locating paths. There are so many things that you could be noting here. Maybe you've got a beautiful, you want to make sure you don't block, or you want to create a privacy screen. In my opinion, there's really no detail too big or too small to be noting when you're working with garden design. As you're taking stock of the conditions of your site, you're going to come across some things that you might see as obstacles. So in these examples, we've got what could be some busted up concrete, large rocks on the top right. You've got flooding, maybe the landscape is spoon-shaped. Maybe you have big redwood trees or oaks that cast a lot of shade. Or I don't know about down in the Valley Water, Santa Clara County area, but up here in Sonoma County, gophers are everywhere. So we have this kind of default to approaching obstacles or inconveniences, you might say, from a mindset of, cart off what we don't want, truck in what we do want. But I like to invite folks to think about approaching these things differently. That's not the most friendly, that method's not the most friendly on your wallet. It's not the most friendly on your planet. And in a lot of cases, even the most efficient with regards to time. So if you think about how we can creatively address these obstacles and see them instead as opportunities. So we've got busted up concrete. It's an opportunity to maybe build out a designated planting bed. We've got an area where rain already collects naturally. We could install a rain garden like this one in the top right that slows down, filters, and infiltrates that excess water while growing really healthy plants. If you're working with a lot of shade, maybe you can't grow cucumbers where you want to, but you do have an opportunity to grow, beautiful redwood understory plants that like shade. And gophers, that's like the $6 million question. But how do you design a landscape that encourages predators who might come and eat those gophers? All within the idea of trying to work with the landscape rather than against it. So one obstacle or opportunity people come up with against a lot that is one of the most important site conditions is your soil. Having healthy soil is, you can't overstate the importance of healthy soil for an abundant, healthy landscape. This is the house for nutrients, all that soil life. It pulls carbon dioxide out of the air and sequesters it in partnership with plants. It helps, having healthy soil helps us store more water, which also leads to healthier plants. We could spend a whole series of webinars on the importance of healthy soil, which is kind of underscored by this quote from FDR. And getting to know the soil that you currently have on site is important because While you can change the health of your soil by increasing organic matter content, you can't really change the type of soil you have. There are a few easy ways to figure out what kind of soil you have, which will help steer a lot of your choices, both in terms of the plants you choose and things like water features like rain gardens that we saw on the last slide. The first would be the ribbon test. So this is a no equipment, very simple field test where it just involves grabbing some moist soil and rubbing it between your thumb and forefinger to see how much of a ribbon is created. And this will tell you a little bit about the clay content in your soil, which will tell you a lot about how water drains in your soil. This is important because some plants don't want to have soggy roots. Some plants are better at surviving in those conditions. Some plants can't break through that dense clay soil. So it's just important to get acclimated and familiar with your soil. There are a few others like a jar test or the percolation test. I think for the sake of time, we'll include a resource in the follow-up email on how to do a percolation test. But at the highest level is just digging a hole, filling it with water, and watching how quickly it drains, which will tell you both a lot about how much clay is in your soil, but also how quickly water drains, which is important to know. We don't want to have standing water on site for more than 72 hours. So I'll be sure to include that resource in the follow-up email we'll be sending out. Regardless of what kind of soil you have, it's almost guaranteed that it could be healthier, especially those of us who live in like urban and suburban areas where a lot of fill has been brought in and soil has been compacted. There's a lot we can do to increase soil organic matter and health. Having living plants with functioning roots and keeping them well hydrated is one super important way to do that. But another is the process that we call sheet mulching. This is another one we've got a lot of resources on that we can share out, but sheet mulching or lasagna gardening is a soil conditioning process that you can actually use to replace your lawn, just to compost it in place rather than ripping it out, which helps preserve soil health. It's just using recycled organic materials like you see on screen to compost in place and add a lot of carbon, nitrogen, and other nutrients to your soil that'll keep the soil life happy, keep your plants happy, and keep a lot more water on site, which is so important during these drought conditions we've been experiencing. So we'll also share out some resources on sheet mulching. Okay, before we jump into the more design process side of the presentation, I'm going to pause for a minute or two, and if you'll indulge me, I'd love to lead everyone through a brief visualization exercise that I learned from our Daily Acts colleague, Corey. So I invite you to plant your feet firmly on the ground, and if you feel comfortable or safe to do so, you could close or lower your eyes. Go ahead and unclench your jaw, relax your shoulders, take a deep breath in. Maybe you're here to get inspired about garden design. As you might know, inspire literally means to breathe in. To conspire is to breathe together. So I invite you all to conspire with us around cultivating regenerative, water-saving landscapes that inspire other people in your community to do the same. Now imagine yourself in your space, your garden, your balcony, your patio, whatever you're working with. And I want you to envision the garden of your dreams. What is it that you want out of it? Is it a place to rest and reflect? Somewhere you go to recharge or for inspiration? Is it a haven for wildlife, or is it maybe an abundant food producing oasis? Maybe it's all those things. What colors are you seeing? What fragrances are you picking up on the breeze? What sounds do you hear? The rustling of leaves, songs of migratory birds, maybe laughter of loved ones, kids running through the garden. Just really invite you to let your imagination off its leash for a moment here. Now go ahead and take the deepest breath you've taken all day. And when you're ready, bring your awareness back to your surroundings, back to the presentation. So on screen here, we have pictures of Daliak's executive director, Trathan Heckman's front garden before he moved in with his family and after they engaged with their imagination and thoughtful observation and cultivated this beautiful garden. So they went from a thirsty monocrop lawn to this abundant garden inspired by forest, full of pollinators, smells, colors, textures, so much food. Just the key takeaway here is that the possibilities are endless. We're kind of, in many cases, working with a fairly blank canvas. Sorry, go ahead. So now that we are maybe a little more grounded and ready to engage our imaginations, start looking at what is it, how do you design a landscape? How do we go from base map to this picture on the right? So my advice that may not apply to everyone in this case is before you even start really thinking about plants, to think about your infrastructure. So anything you have or want on site that it would be really hard to move. So pathways, driveways, patios, and any water systems, things like in-ground water harvesting earthworks like gardens and swales, and then above ground rainwater harvesting systems or even gray water reed systems. These are things that would be very hard to move compared to a 6-month-old plant from a 1-gallon pot. It's good to get these at least planned, if not implemented, or you get attached to plant placements. This little diagram or picture on the bottom right, another topic we could spend hours and hours on is to slow, spread, sink, and store the flow of water across your landscape. We don't have that kind of time, so I'm just going to say any efforts that we can collectively make to slow water's journey through the watershed, so from rain cloud out to the bay, for example, or from your roof out to the street storm drain, does so much to rehydrate the landscape, groundwater tables, aquifers, which all helps slow down climate change. So anything we can do in that regard is a huge important strategy in the toolkit of water conservation and so much more. So on the left, we've got a rainwater harvesting system that overflows into a rain garden. On the right, we've got a different kind of rainwater harvesting system. Just a really quick look on the left, we've got laundry to landscape, gray water, so the water from the washing machine going out to the landscape. The top left is the other side of that, watering fruit trees. Top right, we've got a curb cut rain garden or bioswale. Bottom right, permeable pavement. These are all things you would want to get figured out before you start putting plants in the ground so that you don't have to dig up a fruit tree a year down the line. I can include some resources on these water strategies in the follow-up email as well. So one more exercise here. These are pictures from what is my favorite of Daliak's model site gardens. We'll take a look at how this was transformed at the end of the presentation and what that garden design looked like. But for now, I just invite you to take a look at these two pictures and maybe share in the chat. We'll just take like 30 seconds. What stands out to you? And Ava, if you want to read any answers as they come in, that'd be great. So what stands out? Where's your eye drawn? What are you noticing? Color, texture, if you notice any plant species you recognize, if you feel drawn in a certain way, any along those lines.
We have people saying colors and variety, colorful and very full of plants, flowers, pollinator heaven, color pathways, variety, taller heights of plants.
Yeah, all great observations. One other thing I would point out is if you look on the left here, for me, this pathway draws my eye towards that tree on the right, which is a Pakistani mulberry, one of the most delicious fruits in the world, if you ask me. And we might call these anchoring features. An anchoring feature is kind of a fancy term for a focal point, simply an element in the landscape that draws the eye. And so on one hand, they're a useful design tool because they're easy to design around. And they kind of help you tell a story in a landscape in a way. But it's also just a useful first mark on what can sometimes be an intimidating blank canvas. You've got your base map and maybe sheet mulch, so you've just got a field of mulch. You're like, oh wow, where do I begin? So an anchoring feature, we can so many different things. Be like we see in these photos, a seating area, a pathway, a fountain, a particular type of tree that you really love, or a statement boulder. It could even be a sculpture or a statue, are just a useful way to get that design process up and running. So you can choose plant elements that highlight those things or that just, look good in combination. So, take it or leave it, but I find that to be a really useful design tool. Whether you're going to use anchoring features or not, from that point, get into the fun stuff, which is also sometimes overwhelming, plant selection. Hopefully, some of the next few slides will help you, mitigate that overwhelm, because there are so many species of plants we can choose from. So quick and easy guideline for choosing plants. Bearing in mind that at this point, you've done your work of carefully observing sectors, and you know where the sun is, how it's moving through your property, or your landscape rather, and which types of plants might thrive better where in terms of their sunlight needs, their water needs. If you can find plants that at minimum are water wise, so moderate or better yet low or even very low water use plants, and at least one of these other benefits, that's a pretty good broad rule of thumb. Ideally you can find plants that are meeting all of these benefits. There are so many more that we could talk about, but this idea of stacking functions or stacking benefits in the garden, in a permaculture design framework, people will often say you should be able to name 3 functions that any plant in your garden is serving. So maybe it's food for pollinators, it's water wise, it's beautiful, maybe it fixes nitrogen into the soil or breaks up compacted soil. We could go on and on, but not only will thinking this way help you choose plants that are going to have the best chance for success in your garden, but it also just invites you deeper into relationship with your garden, which will lend itself towards, thriving garden that you have more enjoyment of. So again, at least water-wise and one other, but we're striving always for more and more benefits, both to humans and to the ecosystem. There are a lot of really great tools online for figuring out whether a plant is water-wise, and I'll touch on one of those in a moment. And I know Nick has a list of good water-wise plants for Valley Water folks that we'll send out after the presentation. But say you're walking through the neighborhood, you see a plant you like, there's not a plant tag, there's nobody there to ask. You want to know whether this is a good water-wise plant for your garden. If it has fuzzy, waxy, or tiny leaves, if it's a succulent like a cactus, or if it's only green in the winter, odds are good that that plant doesn't need a lot of water to survive. Whereas if they're huge leaves, very soft, it's like this hydrangea on the right-hand side, probably a higher water use plant. So again, very blunt tool for surgery, but a useful thing to remember when you're out in the world and maybe don't have, a smartphone with one of those plant identifying apps to use. If you are, at your computer and you know the name of a plant that you are interested in including in your garden, UC Davis has this wonderful tool that we call WCALS, Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. It's a searchable database. You can use it really in two different ways. You punch in your location. So as you can see here, we've got San Jose. You can either type in the name of a plant that you're curious about, or you can select, low water use plants and a plant type, tree, shrub, or vine, annual, perennial, so on. And it will bring up, if you search by the plant, it will tell you that plant and varietals of its water use needs based on where you are, because the plant may not have the same water use needs in San Francisco, for example, as it does in Santa Clara, or somewhere like Cloverdale, north where I am in Sonoma County, which is very hot and dry. And if you search by plant type and water use, it'll give you lots of good options to pull from. So again, we've got plant lists coming your way in the follow-up, so stay tuned for those. Another important consideration when designing a garden is, do you want to work with native plants or non-native plants, mix of the two? This is a pretty commonly discussed topic. Maybe you're already familiar, but for those who aren't, native species have co-evolved with their home ecosystems over millennia. Like on a human scale, it's an inconceivable amount of time, right? Over those many, many thousands of years and more, they've both competed and collaborated with all the other species of that ecosystem, right? Whether it's other plants or insects that want to eat them, herbivores that want to eat them, with the soil life, and they've been, having generation after generation adjusting to that particular region's climate. So for one, they're profoundly better set up for success than a plant that doesn't have that deep historical relation to place. Sorry about the train noise, smart train going by. But another important consideration is that they're really important within native food webs. So I think a lot of birds in particular. So on the left here, we've got some type of white oak species. And on the right, we've got a ginkgo biloba. One is native, one is not. The native oak can support 537 species of caterpillars, whereas the non-native tree only supports 4, which for a non-native is actually not too bad, but the difference is pretty stark. Many caterpillars, which are super important for birds' diets, are specialists. It means they can only eat the one type of plant they've evolved to eat. Like we hear about monarch butterflies, their caterpillars only eat milkweed, right? So just keeping in mind that when we work with natives, we're working with the ecosystem that our garden is a part of. Native species can be just as beautiful or even more beautiful than a lot of non-native plants. These are just a few excellent options. Again, Nick has some plant lists for you. We have some plant lists. There are also a ton of resources you can look into, like the California Native Plant Society. for examples of native plants to work with. There's also this really wonderful searchable database from the Audubon Society that will prioritize native plants that are most beneficial to both local and migratory birds in your area, which is kind of fun to look into in my experience anyway. So again, if you're designing your garden with climate change, wildlife habitat, pollinator populations, and or water conservation in mind, natives are almost always going to be your best bet, if not always the best bet. But that doesn't mean there aren't other options. Certainly not telling you can only garden with native species. If you're going to use plants that are not native, you want to avoid anything that could be invasive or opportunistic, which is having like behavior. So a good rule of thumb is here in coastal California, we experience a Mediterranean climate. So if a plant is from one of these yellow highlight regions that also has a Mediterranean climate, odds are good that they will be successful and more or less healthy growing here in the Bay Area. Pineapple guava is one example that's really common that comes from like the Palestine area, but thrives here in California. So moving on to the more visual side of things. This is, people who are artists will probably have a much more sophisticated understanding of color than I do, but I find this color wheel super useful. The high level is if you want a soothing feel, you're going to look for plants that have analogous colors like this, these purples and blues we see on the left. For warmth and more excitement, these complementary colors like maybe that red violet and the yellow green that have a really lively contrast. Surround a favorite plant or an anchoring feature, for example, with complementary colors to make it really stand out. Worth noting though, if you go out into like a native ecosystem, maybe you're hiking through the Sierras or just the foothills around where you live, most like meadows that have wildflowers, you're going to see most of these colors and more. So in my opinion, it's kind of hard to go wrong, but if you are looking for a more cultivated aesthetic, this is a good high level tool or simple basic tools. I personally like to use a combination of those strategies, have really rich, interesting gardens. So if you look through these pictures, examples of analogous colors, complementary colors, tertiary colors, all interplaying. Just trust your eye, plant what you like. You'll also want to embrace seasonality in your garden. So both in terms of visual appeal and to be supportive of pollinators and other wildlife, it's really great if you can have at least one type of plant in your garden flowering all throughout the year. Kind of a fun upside of that is when more like cottage garden style landscape is, bare and dormant in the winter. Maybe your manzanita has, thousands of pink, white, bell-shaped flowers growing on it, and garden is buzzing with pollinators and visiting birds. So you might make a chart like this to keep track of the seasonality of the garden. In this example, they use this blue-green to signify whether plants are pollinated by wind or by pollinators. Personally, I prefer to use the color that plant flowers. So say I've got like a yarrow, I would mark all the months that it's blooming in white, or if it's a yellow variety of yarrow, I would do it in yellow. So that gives me a sense of what colors I'm going to have, what time of year. It's great you can do this for maintenance guides, so you know when to harvest things. Just a really organized way to interact with the garden. So I know that was a lot of information dumping up front. So I think it might be useful to kind of walk through what the design process might look like through an example we here at Daily Acts. So over between 2020 and 2021, we worked with a couple homeowners in the town of Windsor, which is north of Santa Rosa on 101, if anyone is familiar, to transform these irrigated turf landscapes to water-wise landscapes. We worked with the homeowners to sheet mulch, like that process we showed you earlier in the presentation, to boost their soil health and to compost that lawn in place. We capped the sprinklers off so that there wouldn't be water going in. And we had consultations with them about what they wanted out of their landscape, kind of like we did in our vision exercise earlier. These folks had a really clear sense of a color palette they wanted. They knew a number of plants that they were positive they wanted in the landscape. They wanted to design the two landscapes kind of as one, mirrored on both sides with an artificial creek in the middle and a patio up behind this bare tree on the right-hand side with chairs. So the fact that they had a sense of what they wanted was really helpful to us, and that will be helpful to you in your own design process. So from there, we made a base map, just like we showed you in the example. I used that same program to make this. I did not capture that second tree here in my base map, so not the best example, but we know it's there, and we captured it in later iterations of the design. From there, after spending some time observing the site and having conversations with the folks who live there, we put together a really a first rough draft that I hand drafted, so excuse any chicken scratch, just to get a sense of what things might look like on the landscape, see what we liked, see where things were maybe competing with each other in a way we didn't want. I will point out that this is a very, very densely planted landscape. I typically wouldn't design quite this densely. I like a little more space to get around my plants to prune and so on. But this is what's wanted. Went through a round of feedback and changed some things and ended up with a final design. So hopefully you can see my cursor. But over on the right-hand side, there's a blank area where we have patio that they installed. We've got these other blank white areas on both sides of the landscape that were turf alternative lawns. So we planted a variety of creeping thyme, like the culinary herb that flowers. You can use it in cooking. And when you step on it, it crushes and the aromatic effect is have statement boulders that they wanted in the middle. This little water drop on the right-hand side is a fountain. Again, very densely planted landscape. This is a pretty detailed example. Just a quick look at the plant that went into this landscape. Some of these are ones that Daily Acts typically doesn't work with because maybe they're more moderate water use, or like top right, the Nandina, which is heavenly bamboo. It's not a plant that we work with because it has berries that can be harmful to birds. But the folks were, they really wanted this plant. So you kind of have to do your own calculus of what you're willing to change, what you're willing to compromise. And to show you just kind of an end product of what it went from turf lawn to newly planted landscape. They're unfortunately a little shadowy with just the time of day I was able to grab these pictures, but just to give a sense of what it looks like translating from rough draft design to implemented design. Just a couple things to point out. We'll try to keep moving for the sake of time, but these are all freshly planted young plants. They have different growth rates, so they grow in over time and be pruned back to have more structured feel. We've got irrigation lines that are on top of the mulch on the right-hand side here that's something we want to avoid. It's really easy to just go back in and cover up with mulch, which we did right after. And just for another example, so you can see some of the plants from the design. You know, we've got manzanita here in the center, the turf lawn. I'm sorry, the thyme lawn on the left with some statement boulders interspersed throughout the landscape. And as this landscape grows in, you saw how dense the landscape was designed. So an important note is that when you're drawing out your design on paper or on the computer, however you choose to do it, you want to be designing with the full size of mature plants in mind, so that you're not having to dig things up and move them. So while there's a lot of open space and just mulch in the landscape right now, as the landscape matures, it's all going to grow in much more density, which is really good for wildlife, having that covered. So looks like we're getting kind of tight on time, so I'll walk quickly through just a couple other examples of what a garden design or a landscape plan can look like. So we saw those pictures earlier from our Petaluma Library model site garden. That landscape was designed by students of Permaculture Design course that we ran with Toby Hemingway a few years ago. This is a super beautiful hand-drafted design. I would not be able to do this myself. Yours definitely does not need to look as this, but if that's in your skill set and you'd like to do it that way, that's amazing. It's really helpful. So we've got our paths, we've got our plants drawn out to what their full size will be. This started as similarly turf lawn, right? And we went through the sheet mulching process, as you can see on the left, sheet mulched by about 100 volunteers, planted by just as many people. You can see on the right that this was this landscape, I don't know, 6 months to a year after planting. So similar to that Windsor example we just looked at, you know, things were pretty sparse, small. And now, you know, 4 or 5 years later, this picture was taken where everything has grown in pretty significantly. As someone pointed out earlier, we've got pollinator paradise, and here's that mulberry tree again. One of our anchoring features, like this central area with benches, which we actually, there's also a sculpture there. So again, it doesn't have to be as professionally rendered as that hand-drawn design. It can be simpler, but still really beautiful, like this colored pencil example. You could, if you hire a landscape design service, it may look something like this, very professional level. Or, you know, if you're just trying to get your plants in the ground, here's an example of a rough draft I did for another landscape Windsor. The scan didn't show up super well, but you know, this is just circles that I drew with a circular stencil. You know, as long as I'm working scale here and I can capture where my plants are and I'm designing with all of those site factors that we talked about in mind, this is all that it has to be. It doesn't have to be more complicated than this unless you want it to be. So, you know, there's a lot of different levels at which you can approach this. It's really up to you. And with that, that feels like a pretty good crash course on the basics of garden design. Before we jump into questions, I will pass it back over to Nick to talk about Valley Water landscape resources. And I'll just pull up a slide for you here in a second.
Hey, appreciate that, Connor. Hey, so hello again, everyone. My name is Nicholas. Again, I'm a water conservation specialist with Valley Water, and I work very closely, specifically with our landscape rebate program. The landscape rebate program has a few different elements to it. The main and most popular element would be the landscape conversion rebate. And it's for any site within Santa Clara County. The standard rebate is $2 per square foot, up to 1,500 square feet of converted high water use landscape. And then in some areas, cities or water retailers for that matter, you can get up to $3 a square foot for the first 1,000 square feet too then after. And those cities would include Morgan Hill, Cupertino, if you pay your water bill to San Jose Municipal Water or the city of San Jose, as well as the city of Santa Clara. In the city of Milpitas and Palo Alto, you can actually get $4 per square foot for that first 1,000 square feet of high water use landscape, and then $2 per square foot then after. Next slide, please. So what did you need to qualify for the landscape conversion rebate? Again, it's for any site, institutional, industrial, commercial, HOA, single family residence, but the check recipient or the recipient of the rebate must be a property owner of the site or authorized site representative, such as a property management company or a trust. And the type of landscape that we're asking or that we're qualifying for this rebate would be existing lawns or filled pools. So if the pool's still functioning, still has water, that would qualify. Existing lawn, that would also qualify, and that's probably our more popular landscape to convert. We kind of just went over the lawns are very high water use landscape. So you can see there's a couple examples here that are different examples of different stages of lawns. This bottom left example is kind of a sorry looking lawn. It's dead, it's patchy. As long as it hasn't been physically scraped, removed, or already mulched over, that we could probably still qualify that lawn. Next slide, please. Once you would need to apply for our program before starting on any parts of your project or making purchases towards your project. Once the application's been submitted, you would want to include the site information for what you're going to be converting, the applicant's information, so mailing address. Then we're going to ask for some photos of how the lawn area or pool currently looks. Once we have that information, we'll reach out to you for an on-site pre-inspection. And once the pre-inspection's been completed, we're getting into now the real part, which what Connor's been preparing you for. That's coming up with that plant list design or plant list and a project design to submit to us. The plant list would need to reach a 50% plant coverage requirement of drought tolerant plants from our approved list that we're going to go ahead and send out to you after this webinar. The other requirements would be to put at least a minimum of 2 inches, preferably 3 inches of a qualifying ground cover. So that could be mulch or river rocks or gravel or decomposed granite, as long as there's no bare soil or exposed soil. And then we'd also ask for efficient irrigation. So that could be capping off sprinklers and hand watering these plants still established, or implementing a drip system of your choice. Next slide, please. Once we have the project plan description and the plant list has been approved on our end, we're going to go ahead and issue a notice to proceed. You'll have 90 days to start on and complete the project. And then once you're complete with your project, you're going to send us in some more photos of that project, just like you did to start off. And once we have the photos, we're going to ask for an updated plant list. If some things changed right there, that's totally fine. As long as you're still reaching our 50% plant coverage requirement, you're still going to be totally eligible for the rebate. There are some non-qualifying materials that will be subtracted out if they're implemented into the conversion area. And those would include vegetable gardens, implementing artificial turf, putting in a new lawn or leaving lawn area, leaving bare soil, or impermeable hardscapes. So any sort of concrete or hardscape that wouldn't allow water to percolate through during a rain event, that area wouldn't be counted towards the rebate. You can see there's a couple of examples right there. The top photo, we would say, we measured the whole lawn when we first went out there. They did, a partial conversion. We're going to measure the remaining lawn and subtract it, and you're going to get the difference. So it's not all or nothing. And once we have verified all this information and that the project's been completed to our standards, then we'll issue that rebate check within 4 to 6 weeks. Next slide, please. I just want to say thank you again, you all for attending this webinar. Here are some resources. We're going to send them out into that email. And another thing we're going to send out in the email is a link to our office hours, which is very similar to this style, except it's a little bit more interactive. And you can go and ask any questions to our team about your proposed landscape rebate project, or if you have questions about the process to get going with the rebates. So that's it's a whole hour just dedicated to that. And it's a great group. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Connor. And again, if you wanted to send us an email about a proposed project you have in mind, you can email conservation@valleywater.org, and our team will be more than happy to help you out with that. Appreciate your efforts in water conservation.
Thank you. So, let's see. Ava, do you want to talk to us about upcoming events real quick before we jump into questions?
That would be great. Yeah, we have a few upcoming webinars. We have a drip irrigation basics coming up on October 15th. And then we also have reusing the rain. It's about making your own rain barrel systems. That will be on November 1st. And it will also be held in Spanish on November 8th. All of these events are at 5:30 and are in the same Zoom webinar format. So join us for those ones to learn about how you can lessen your water bill and reduce your water intake. So while still maintaining a beautiful garden. So let's jump into the Q&A though, because it seems like we have quite a lot of questions in there. I'm going to do the ones directed towards Nick first. In the rebate program, looks like, I'm just gonna read this whole thing. In the rebate program, as someone relatively unfamiliar with the various species of approved plants, can I assume the water-wise plants in my local Lowe's or nurseries are appropriate for the program? How specific do I need to get?
Yeah, that's a great question. We would prefer for you to get pretty species specific, because different subspecies of plants can have a lot of different growth rates and sizes. And so if you go to we have it on our website that you can check out our list of drought tolerant plants. And those plants are going to have, that list is going to have the botanical name, the common name, and then it's going to have a number next to it. That number is coverage at full maturity, and we have many species and subspecies included in there to break them down. Another recommendation I would give would be we have a list of water-wise nurseries on our website, and you can check those areas out. Those are a little bit more localized nurseries, and they typically have a little bit more selection on the drought tolerant plants.
Great, thank you. And we can drop those resources in a follow-up email as well. Nick, another one is, I took out my lawn before knowing about rebates. Are there any other opportunities?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So I did mention that all rebates would need to be applied for and receive approval before any work being started on. So it doesn't sound like your lawn project's going to be able to be included in the rebate program. However, we do, Connor and Ava mentioned some rainwater capture systems, and we do have rebates that would include for rainwater capture, as well as including or purchasing high efficiency irrigation equipment to be implemented and replace the old outdated stuff. If you wanted to, also, I'd just say before purchasing or starting on those projects, please fill out an application and receive approval. And you can always reach out to our team, conservation@valleywater.org. As I mentioned earlier, send us an email. If you have a very specific landscape that maybe you're not sure is clear cut for our program, send us a photo of it. That's the best way for our team to see that.
Okay, Nick, last one is oh, never mind, it was the same one. So
great. Yeah, most important thing to take away: apply and receive approval before starting on your projects.
Great, thank you. Okay, are there any tips to select plants by size, height, elevation? Select plants by size, height, elevation.
So yeah, I mean, it's going to be very dependent on your context and your circumstances, right? Like, the general tip is the taller plants that you incorporate into your landscape, the more shade they're going to cast. So you're going to want to think about, do you want plants that are screening your windows? Do you want plants that are lower than your windows? Or yeah, it's tough to answer because I don't know, what your garden looks like or what you're hoping for. But I would say my tip would be to think about where your focal point of the garden is. Like, do you have a sitting area that you see yourself spending a lot of time in? Are you mostly looking at your garden through a window? Are you wanting a garden that looks really beautiful from the curb or the street? And from there, design different height structures based on what it will look like from that angle, right? And so you don't want to be, in my opinion anyway, everyone's taste is different, but I don't like to do like really regular, like here's my 1 foot plants, here are my 2 foot plants, 3 foot and up, because I prefer a more fluid, wilder look. So I like to do a lot of contrast and mix it up. Maybe I have one shrub that's like 4 feet tall and it's plants that are more 18, 24 inches tall, and off to the side is a small tree or something. Personally, my tip is variety, and just really focus on visioning the landscape that you want out of it. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you. The next question is about sheet mulching. Before you cover it with cardboard, should you put anything on it to get rid of the grubs?
Grubs. I'm not sure what they mean by that. If they mean like life that's in the soil, you don't want to get rid of that. Typically, cardboard is the first layer that you're going to put down. We definitely don't advise anything like wheat fabric, because it's made of plastic. It'll kind of decompose into, not decompose, but disintegrate into plastic, microplastics that you don't want in the soil. If you want to ask another question with more detail on what you're worried about, you can do that. But otherwise, typically, there's nothing you put down in advance. Like if you needed to amend your soil, you might put in some soil amendments. But other than that, I don't think there's cardboard.
I see a raised hand. Put your questions into the chat if you have any. Another question is, any advice if the yard space is filled with landscaping rocks or gravel, especially if it's been there long enough so it's gotten so worked into the soil that it can't really be removed?
So if it can't be removed, I mean, technically you could build soil on top, but it's going to drain water pretty quickly if there's a layer of gravel underneath it. I would try to design around larger rocks or remove it and try to use it in a creative way in the landscape. Wow, 5 inches worked down into the soil. I might, if you, I'm looking at the Q&A, so Courtney, if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to think more about this and get you an answer, because I'm not really sure what the best option.
And thank you all for putting your questions in. We might not get around to them all today, but you can contact us if you have more. And then Bob asked, is sheet mulching much better than removing the lawn?
I would say definitely. If you remove the lawn, you're going to disturb the soil structure and just leave a bunch of exposed soil. Whereas if you sheet mulch, leave it, you can plant and sheet mulch on the same day. My preference is to sheet mulch a few months ahead of planting to let everything start to break down and get that soil biology really kicking. But in general, it's the benefits it's providing to your soil's health and water storage capacity is night and day compared to ripping the lawn out.
We have once sheet mulching is done, you cut holes in the cardboard where you want to plant. And also we have a webinar on sheet mulching to answer these questions as well. But Connor, if you want to take that.
Yeah, we'll definitely send along some sheet mulching resources that go into all the nitty-gritty of the process, but you nailed it. If you sheet mulch and then you go back to plant after, typically what we'll do is just take like a box cutter and cut an X where we want to plant and like tuck those wedges of cardboard underneath and plant in right there. Making sure that you have the crown of the plant and the root ball actually in the soil. Yeah, so definitely we'll send along some more resources that go into more detail.
Can you put in a drip system after you've mulched?
Totally. Yeah, that's typically how we do it, actually. I mentioned in that picture that we want the irrigation lines to be under the mulch, but you would just kind of dig out a little trench for your lines in the mulch and put the mulch on top. The reason we do this is to protect it from UV radiation, so the sunlight will break down the plastic of your irrigation lines over time. They can also be a tripping hazard, which could hurt somebody, but could also disconnect your irrigation and cause leaks. And it just doesn't look as nice. So you can sheet mulch and then not put your drip in for 6 months, year, when.
Great. Is flammability also taken into account when choosing plants, especially those located next to the house?
Yeah, so different for every site, and it's up to you to make your own risk assessments. We do have a really wonderful webinar recording with a group of fire professionals from Sonoma and Marin counties talking about all the best practices from their professional opinions on landscape fire design. So that's a big topic. But what I will say really briefly, and we'll send you that resource in the follow-up email. What I would say briefly is, if you're worried about fire where you are, I would keep a 5-foot buffer around the house with no flammable material, including plants. Because the reality is all plants are flammable. Some people will tell you succulents are not flammable. It's just not true. So we have a lot of great guidelines around preventing pathways for fire to the house and choosing plants that are, have less oil or resin content. And yeah, I don't want to get too into the details. So we'll send you that resource.
Great. How long did the Windsor example take to implement from design to completion? I'm particularly interested in composting the turf lawn and how long that took for the soil to be ready.
Yeah, great question. So this one was an interesting example because we started the process right before COVID and that slowed us down significantly. But I would say if not for COVID, it would have been like probably a 6-month process. We've done landscape transformations using the same model in less time than that. We did ones in Katati this year that were from maybe December, like I guess even later than that, like January or February, and wrapping up in May. But for sheet mulching, like I said, you can technically plant the same time or before you sheet mulch. Some people, like, if you've got big trees, you're going to sheet mulch around them, right? You could sheet mulch and then plant immediately. We've done that in celiac installations when that's the option that makes the most sense. You don't want to wait so long that all of that organic matter has broken down and composted, but like my preference with sheet mulching is if I could sheet mulch a site in the early fall and then let it sit through the rainy season and then plant in the spring. So, 6 months, give or take. That is, anecdotally my best practice. I don't know from a soil science perspective what like the best time is, but that's, the moisture is going to speed up that decomposition process. So a few months is great. If you don't want to wait that long, you don't have to.
Great. Another question we have is, if landscaping around a tree that drops a lot of litter, how can I design a garden to incorporate the litter and avoid the mow and blow?
That's a good question. So, I mean, the beauty of leaf litter is if you don't mind the way it looks, it's an excellent mulch, right? It's really great habitat for all manner of insects to lay eggs that are good for pollination and food sources for things like birds. Where it might be more annoying and kind of a maintenance headache is if you have plants underneath that canopy that are going to get a lot of leaves stuck in their branches or foliage. So if you keep that in mind when you're selecting plants, you might look for, kind of feel them out, right? Like feel the branches and think about whether those, I don't know if it's black walnut or an English walnut, but fairly large leaves, just to think about whether they'll get stuck in the branches or foliage. In general, otherwise, like if they're just falling onto your mulch or the soil surface, it's actually a good thing. Hoping that collectively we can start to have kind of a perspective shift around leaf litter so that fewer and fewer people are doing the mow and blow.
Okay, and this is a good question. If I decide not to put any mounds or berms into my design, and then it rains a lot, and I have drought tolerant plants, will I regret not putting any berms in?
Might not. So it depends on what kind of slope you're working with and what soil type you have and what the condition of your soil is. If you've got a slope on your landscape and really clay dominant or compacted soil, and the water just sheets off and doesn't stay on site long enough to infiltrate, then you're going to regret not doing some earthworks like basins to slow the water down and keep it on site, even with drought tolerant plants. If you have sheet mulch, so you've got the mulch already is going to slow the flow of water and help it store on site, it may not be necessary. But I'm a big fan of rain gardens and swales. Like I love rain harvesting barrels, but in terms of recharging the groundwater, rain gardens and swales are immensely helpful. So I think really only you can answer that question by looking at your site, thinking about slope and soil type, and asking yourself like, okay, what are the downsides to putting in berms and basins and things like that?
Great. Yeah, I think it's very site dependent, and that's why it's really important to know your soil type on your property. Great. Okay, we have about 4 more minutes for questions, and I know there's a lot of questions. I've gotten the question a few times of how do people hire Daily Axe team? And we do not do garden design. Unfortunately, we can't do a personal garden design. We're just here to relay the information and the skills. But on our website, we do have a lot of resources for you.
Yeah. If you're, I don't know where you're located, if you're in Sonoma County, we can, Sonoma or Marin even, we can recommend some really wonderful landscape designers. Maybe Nicholas knows some folks down in the South Bay area. But there are many folks who are as or more experienced with garden design as we are, and coming from the same place of trying to regenerate landscapes and prioritizing the kinds of things that we are.
Yeah, we can throw some of those into a follow-up email as well, our recommendations for designers. Great. Is there a list of plants that deter rodents, or rodents keep rodents away, or rodents don't like, or outdoor cats from defecating in your yard?
There might be, but I do not have that list. I know that we have put together, I had someone ask about plants that are like resilient to dog pee before, so I did put together a list of those. I would try just a little some Google research, and if you don't come up with anything, send me an email and I can ask around with some colleagues to see if anyone has some good recommendations for you.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions, and this one seems timely. So I'm doing sheet mulching tomorrow. So if I have to design a basin in it, would be helpful to know that soon.
So I'm guessing this is the same person who is asking about whether they would regret not doing it. Yeah, it sounds like if you're pressed for time, that would be worth focusing on right now, where you want to have any kind of intentional topography. So if you're sheet mulching, if you dig your edges, right, like typically when we sheet mulch, the one step I didn't really go into detail in is you'll dig like a wedge shaped trench up against any hardscape so that your cardboard can roll into it, and also the mulch and the compost don't spill out onto like the sidewalk or your driveway. So depending on how big your landscape is, you're going to end up with a bunch of soil. So what you could do is intentionally place all that soil in really shallow berms or mounds, so that when water does fall on, if this is the same person, your flat landscape, it will be encouraged to stay in certain spots for longer. Yeah, I wish I could have a better answer for you, but without being able to spend some time looking at the site, I think that's the best I can do.
Great. Okay, I think that's all the time we're going to have for Q&A. I see a lot of people asking about basins and going into more detail about that, but we can send that in a follow-up. We have some great handouts and resources on what is a basin. So great. Okay, I think we just have to wrap this up. Unfortunately, we have a hard stop at 7, but thank you everybody for joining today. And a special thanks to our sponsors, without whom this would not be possible. They help us continue to do these programs and educate the public. So big thanks to them. And if you have any more questions, email Connor at dailyaxe.org, or our number is on the screen. You could give us a ring as well. Again, we have those 2 presentations coming up about drip irrigation and rainwater catchment. So you can go to dailyaxe.org/upcoming events to check those out. So
yeah, I will say email is a better bet than phone call right now. This is our office line, and we're mostly working remotely still. So you can, reach anyone, our colleagues, we're all first name at DailYaxe. So reach out to me, reach out to Ava, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. And just a last plug that we will be sending a follow-up email that has a recording of this presentation, as well as all kinds of resources, including landscape rebate resources for you to use as you move forward in the garden design process. Ava, it looks like we might have, I don't know, my clock says 6:56. We could probably take a couple more questions before.
That's what I was just thinking too. I think I concluded that too early. That'd take a little longer, but I'm really glad that so many people had so many great questions too, and we're very engaged. We got a question about weed prevention in the chat. I can't find your question, but what would you recommend for weed prevention, Connor?
For weed prevention?
Yes.
Well, so, I mean, to keep ringing the same bell, sheet mulching is not bulletproof, or weed proof, I should say, but it is a good way to stifle weeds from germinating. That's what the cardboard is all about. It's also organic matter to break down, but it's a barrier to keep sunlight from reaching weeds. Certain weeds like crabgrass, things like that are really pervasive will get through sheet mulch. So one thing you can do is a process called solarization. At this point, unfortunately, you probably have to wait until next summer to do that. We cover that in our sheet mulching webinar, so you can check that out. Otherwise, in my experience, the best way to fight against weeds is to, encourage the plants you do want and plant, like larger shrubs that will shade out and outcompete. Yeah, we're very much, hand tool maintenance kind of people. We don't use any weed killers, anything like that. So pulling weeds out. If they're weeds that haven't gone to seed, you can just cut them down at the soil level, or like dig away, half an inch of soil and cut them. If they've gone to seed, you might just pull them out wholesale. Yeah, it's another big topic that's hard to cover in just a minute.
Great, thank you for that, Connor. We do have to conclude. We do have a hard stop at 7, just a minute before, but thank you all for coming and for your questions and being engaged and sticking around for those questions. So hope you guys all have a good rest of your night.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thank you Valley Water for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming.